Princess Alara Voss had refused 11 marriage proposals by the time she turned 23, and her father had stopped attending the rejections in person around number 7. Another one, her lady's maid, Petra, whispered, peering through the gap in the receiving hall's tall doors at the latest suitor, a broad-shouldered alpha from the Eastern Territories, considerably more handsome than the last 3 combined, currently straightening his jacket with the particular confidence of a man who'd never once been told no. That's the Ashgrove heir. His family owns half the northern trade routes. Then he can go marry the trade routes, Alara said, not looking up from the book open across her knees. I hear they're considerably more agreeable than I am. It wasn't cruelty, exactly, that made her refuse them. It was arithmetic, worked out slowly over 18 exhausting months. 11 suitors, 11 conversations that all followed the same shape. A man cataloging his territory's wealth, his pack's strength, the considerable honor he'd be doing her by choosing her, as though marrying a princess nobody at court paid much attention to anymore was a favor she owed him rather than a life she was entitled to actually want. Alara had grown up in the long shadow of a crown princess sister who died at 19, in a kingdom that had spent 4 years quietly, politely forgetting the second daughter existed, except when a marriage alliance made her briefly, transactionally useful again. She'd learned, somewhere in those 4 grieving years, that being chosen for the right reasons mattered considerably more than simply being chosen at all. She'd rather grow old alone with her books than marry a man who wanted her title and called it love. The 12th suitor arrived on a gray morning in early spring, and Alara nearly didn't bother attending the reception at all. She'd have skipped it entirely if Petra hadn't reminded her, gently, that skipping only meant rescheduling. She was glad, later, desperately, quietly glad, that she went. Because Lycan King Darius Ashcombe didn't walk into that hall the way the other 11 had, chin up, confidence worn like armor, already halfway through a mental list of everything he intended to offer her. He knelt, in the doorway, before he'd even crossed half the room, in front of her entire startled court, and said the one thing none of the other 11 had thought to say first. I'm not here to convince you that you should want me, he said, voice carrying clean through a hall that had gone suddenly, uncomfortably silent. I'm here to ask what you actually want, and I intend to wait as long as it takes to hear the honest answer. Werewolf Kingdom had spent 4 years operating on a quiet, unspoken rule that nobody had ever formally announced, but everyone at court somehow understood perfectly. The crown's attention belonged to matters of state, matters of succession, matters that could be measured and reported and resolved through proper channels. Grief, being none of those things, simply wasn't discussed. It was managed at a careful, permanent distance, the way you'd manage a wound you decided not to look at too closely for fear of what you'd find underneath the bandage. Alara's older sister, Rosalind, had been the crown princess, brilliant, warm, beloved by the entire court in the effortless way some people simply are, the kind of person rooms rearranged themselves around without her ever needing to ask. She died at 19 from a wasting fever that took her in 11 agonizing days and left an entire kingdom reeling in ways nobody quite knew how to process out loud. King Aldrich Voss had 2 daughters. After Rosalind's death, he behaved, for the most part, as though he had none. Not through deliberate cruelty. Alara had come to understand this slowly, over years of careful, painful observation, but through a grief so total, so structurally load-bearing, that he'd simply never learned how to look at his surviving daughter without seeing the exact shape of the one he'd lost standing just behind her, close enough to hurt. Alara had been 19 herself when Rosalind died. Old enough to understand precisely what was happening in the sick room down the hall. Too young to know how to stop any of it, the fever, or the 4 years of careful, quiet erasure that followed. She'd built a life almost entirely her own in the year since. The palace library, where the librarian Master Corwin had long ago stopped commenting on how many hours she spent curled in the same window seat. Long walks along the eastern wall at dusk, when the light did something soft and forgiving to the whole kingdom that made it easier, briefly, to imagine herself belonging to it. A small, loyal circle among the household staff, Petra chief among them, who had never once, in 4 years, treated her like a political instrument rather than a person. Her father's council, meanwhile, had gradually begun treating her as exactly that. An asset. A resource whose value needed to be properly extracted now that the crown's actual heir apparent had died and the succession question had grown considerably more urgent, more anxious, more prone to sudden council meetings that ended with another suitor's name added to a growing, tedious list. 11 suitors in 18 months. 11 men who arrived already certain of the outcome, treating the proposal itself as a formality standing between them and whatever alliance her hand represented, grain surpluses recited like love poetry, mothers who did the actual proposing while their sons nodded at appropriate intervals, one memorable young lord who had brought a scale model of his territory's harbor, apparently believing infrastructure made for effective courtship. Alara refused every single one, and the court, gradually, began calling her difficult, proud, ungrateful for opportunities considerably grander than a forgotten second daughter deserved. She'd stopped caring what the court called her sometime around suitor number 6, when she'd realized the words said considerably more about the court's expectations than about anything true regarding herself. King Darius Ashcombe ruled a modest, well-respected northern territory called Fellhollow, considerably smaller than Vareth, and considerably less politically useful as an alliance than half the men who'd already tried and failed to win Alara's hand. He'd inherited his throne at 19, the same terrible year Alara lost her sister, following his own father's sudden death in a border skirmish that had left Fellhollow's council scrambling and its young, grieving king with no time whatsoever to properly mourn before he was expected to rule. He'd spent 6 years since learning, through considerable hard-won trial and no small amount of early failure, that ruling a kingdom well required listening to people considerably more than commanding them. It was a lesson that had cost him, in his first year, the near collapse of a border treaty he'd tried to force through without properly consulting the villages it actually affected, a mistake he never repeated, and one that had quietly reshaped the entire philosophy of his reign. He hadn't intended to become suitor number 12. He'd traveled to Vareth, initially, for an entirely unrelated trade discussion regarding grain tariffs neither kingdom particularly wanted to keep negotiating by messenger. He'd simply happened to arrive at the palace on the same gray morning a merchant's caravan had, and had found himself, waiting in an antechamber for his own scheduled meeting, witnessing, from the edge of a crowded reception hall he'd wandered into out of idle curiosity, the exact moment Princess Alara Voss dismissed her 11th suitor with a tired, practiced patience of someone who had long since stopped expecting anyone to actually ask what she wanted. He found, watching that dismissal, that he genuinely, urgently wanted to know the answer himself. He canceled his trade meeting the following morning. His advisors were, to a man, appalled. Alara almost skipped the reception entirely. She'd woken with a headache, real or invented. She genuinely couldn't tell anymore, for years having taught her body a convenient repertoire of symptoms exactly suited to whatever excuse the day required, and had spent a good 20 minutes debating with Petra whether the princess is indisposed, would hold up against her father's counsel one more time. They'll only reschedule, Petra said, pinning the last of Alara's hair into place with more patience than the situation probably deserved, standing behind her at the dressing table with 3 pins still held between her lips. Better to get it over with. You're good at this part. I'm good at saying no, Alara corrected, watching her own reflection in the dressing mirror with the particular detachment she'd learned to bring to these mornings. That is not the same thing as enjoying it. No, Petra agreed. But it's a talent all the same. Most princesses would have simply married the fourth one and been done with it, however dreadful his mother was about the whole affair. His mother wasn't dreadful, Alara said. She was simply thorough. I respected the thoroughness. I just didn't want to marry her son because of it. Petra laughed, low and warm, and set the final pin. There. You look considerably more composed than you feel, which is the whole point of the exercise. They went. Alara always went. In the end, some stubborn, unexamined part of her refusing to let the council believe hiding was ever genuinely an option, even on mornings when hiding sounded considerably more appealing than another hour of careful, practiced rejection performed in front of an audience that had, by this point, seen the routine enough times to grow visibly bored between the interesting parts. The receiving hall was fuller than usual that morning, which should have told her something before she'd even crossed the threshold. She noticed, taking her seat, several members of her father's council clustered near the northern doors. Lord Halvard, Lady Pemberton, old Chancellor Grieve, all of them murmuring together in the particular tone of men and women discussing something they found genuinely, unusually interesting rather than merely obligatory. "Who is it this time?" she asked Petra quietly, settling into the small dais where these meetings always unfolded. "King Darius Ashcombe." Fell hollow territory. Petra's eyebrows rose, just slightly. Younger than most of them. Considerably better looking too, if the kitchen gossip's accurate. The kitchen gossip is always accurate about that particular category, Alara said dryly. It's the only category it's ever consistently right about. She arranged her expression into the polite, distant courtesy that had carried her through 11 previous conversations, chin level, hands folded, a smile held carefully in reserve rather than offered freely, and waited. Darius Ashcombe entered the hall, and Alara noted, with the detached professional interest of someone who'd catalogued this exact moment 11 times before, that the kitchen gossip hadn't exaggerated. Dark hair, cut simply, a little too long at the front in a way that suggested he hadn't bothered with it recently. A sharp jaw, the kind of solid, unshowy build that suggested a man who fought his own battles rather than simply commanding others to fight them for him. He wore Fellhollow's forest green without excessive ceremony. No elaborate cape, no jeweled circlet, just plain, well-made clothes that suggested more genuine substance than performance. He crossed perhaps a third of the hall's length before he stopped. And knelt. Alara blinked, actually blinked, the polite mask slipping for the first time in 18 months. This wasn't part of the choreography. Suitors bowed, certainly, at a respectful, formal distance, brief and correct. They did not kneel in the middle of a crowded receiving hall, halfway across the room, like they were proposing to a stranger on some distant battlefield rather than negotiating a political marriage in front of 24 watching nobles. Beside her, she heard Petra make a small, startled sound and quickly disguise it as a cough. "Your Highness," Darius said, and his voice carried clean and level to every corner of the suddenly, uncomfortably silent hall. Not performed, not projected for effect, simply steady, like a man who'd said something similar to himself several times before saying it aloud. "I understand 11 men have stood in this room before me. And I understand you refused every one of them." He paused. Nobody moved. "I'm not here to be the 12th man who assumes he'll succeed where they failed," he said. "I'm here because I'd like to ask you an honest question, and I'd genuinely like an honest answer, whatever that answer turns out to be. Not what your council wants from you. Not what my own territory needs from this match. What you actually want, Princess Alara. Assuming anyone's bothered asking you that in longer than you'd probably like to admit out loud." The hall had gone entirely, thoroughly silent, half the assembled nobility clearly unsure whether they were witnessing genuine sincerity or an unusually clever new negotiating tactic dressed up in humility. Chancellor Grieve had actually stopped murmuring, his mouth slightly open. Alara studied the kneeling man for a long moment, old caution warring, unexpectedly, with something considerably more curious than she'd felt walking into that hall an hour earlier. That, she said finally, is a considerably more interesting question than I've been asked in 18 months. Somewhere near the doors, she heard Lady Pemberton whisper something urgently to Lord Halvard. She ignored it. "You can stand," Alara added, when Darius made no move to rise. "I don't require you to remain there through this entire conversation. Watching you kneel is beginning to hurt my own knees in sympathy." Darius stood, unhurried, no visible relief, no performance of gratitude, simply a man returning to his feet because a reasonable request had been made of him. Something in the ease of it, the lack of theater, settled small and cautious in Alara's chest, in a place she hadn't expected any of the 12 suitors to reach. "I don't make promises," she said, "about outcomes. Not to you. Not to anyone who stood in that particular spot before you." "I'm not asking for a promise," Darius said. "I'm asking for a conversation. I'd like to know whether you're willing to have one." Alara glanced briefly toward her father's empty chair. He hadn't attended, of course, hadn't attended since Suitor 7, and then back to the man still standing 3/4 of the way across the hall, waiting for her actual answer rather than assuming it. "Sit," she said finally, gesturing toward the chair usually reserved for exactly this kind of formal negotiation. "We'll see how far honest actually gets us." He didn't propose that first day. He didn't propose the second day either, which surprised Alara considerably more than the kneeling had. She'd half expected the dramatic gesture to be simply an unusually theatrical version of the same 11 conversations, arriving eventually at the same list of assets and alliances dressed up in slightly better staging. Instead, on the third morning, a palace page found her in the library with a simple, handwritten note. "Would you object to company, or would you prefer solitude today? I'll respect whichever you choose."
The asterisk.
Alara sat with the note for a long moment, turning it over in her hands, before finally writing back, on the reverse. "Company is acceptable. I make no promises about conversation, **. He arrived within the hour and found her exactly where Petra had, by then, quietly informed the entire household staff she could most reliably be found, curled into the deep window seat at the library's eastern end, a history text open across her knees, considerable afternoon light pooling gold across the worn floorboards. "You're not going to propose today either, are you?" Alara said, not quite looking up as he settled into the chair across from her window seat. "Not today," Darius confirmed. "I thought I might ask what you're reading instead." "The Fall of the Ashgrove Dynasty," Alara said, turning the book so he could see its cracked spine. "Considerably more interesting than the current Ashgrove heir, who proposed to me somewhere around suitor number 4. "I remember hearing about that one," Darius said, and something almost like genuine amusement flickered at the corner of his mouth. "He compared my eyes to his kingdom's finest sapphire mine," Alara said flatly. "I believe he meant it as a compliment." "That's a genuinely terrible thing to say to someone," Darius said, and the honest, unguarded laugh that followed made Alara look up properly for the first time since he'd sat down. "You're allowed to find that funny," she said. "I did too, eventually. Mostly because the alternative was considerable irritation, and I'd already spent that particular emotion on suitor number 3. "What was wrong with number 3? "He brought his mother," Alara said. "She did the majority of the actual proposing." He stood beside her, nodding at what I assume were pre-agreed intervals. Darius laughed again, a real laugh this time, surprised fully out of him, and the sound settled comfortably into the quiet, dust-warm library air around them in a way that made Alara's own mouth twitch despite 4 years of careful, deliberate reserve. "I promise," he said, once he'd recovered, "I have no intention of bringing my mother. She passed several years ago, and even if she hadn't, I suspect she'd have considerably stronger opinions about my own life choices than I'd want represented in a formal proposal. A relief, Elara said dryly, though something in her chest had loosened slightly. Over the course of this exchange, the cautious, unfamiliar loosening of someone who'd spent 4 years expecting every interaction to eventually reveal its transactional foundation, and hadn't yet found one. 3 visits into this particular acquaintance. They talked for the better part of an hour. About the Ashgrove dynasty's slow, tedious collapse, about a border dispute Valhalla had recently, carefully resolved through patient negotiation rather than the show of force his own counsel had initially recommended, about nothing in particular, the kind of meandering, low-stakes conversation Elara realized, with some surprise, she hadn't had with anyone outside her own small circle of household staff in longer than she could easily remember. He returned the following day, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, the palace staff had grown thoroughly accustomed to seeing the Lycan King of Valhalla wandering the eastern gardens in the mornings or reading quietly across from the princess in her usual window seat in the afternoons, considerably less formal, considerably less ceremonial than his dramatic kneeling entrance had suggested he might behave going forward. He hasn't asked for anything yet, Petra observed on the 6th day, helping Elara change out of her afternoon dress. Not the sapphire mine sort of asking, nor the trade route sort. Just talking. I know, Elara said, and found she wasn't entirely certain how she felt about it. The not asking, the patience, the way it kept catching her slightly off balance in a fashion the previous 11, with their eager, transactional certainty, had never once managed. Is that a good thing? Petra asked. Or, does it worry you? Elara considered the question seriously, watching her own reflection in the dressing mirror. Both, she admitted finally. I don't entirely know what to do with someone who isn't in a hurry. It was on the 9th evening, walking the eastern wall alone at dusk the way she had nearly every evening for 4 years, that Elara finally let herself think properly about what was happening, not the careful, guarded version she allowed herself in Darius's presence, but the fuller, messier truth she usually only permitted here, on this particular stretch of ancient stone, with nobody watching. The eastern wall overlooked the old orchard where she and Rosalind used to run as children, back when running had still felt like something uncomplicated rather than something she needed to consciously choose to allow herself. Rosalind had always run faster. Rosalind had always been faster at everything, in the effortless, unhurried way some people simply were. Faster to charm a room, faster to understand a treaty's fine print, faster to know exactly what a grieving villager or an anxious young courtier needed to hear. Elara had been the slow one, the quiet one, the one who read in corners while her sister filled halls with easy, uncomplicated warmth. You're not her, she reminded herself, the way she'd taught herself to over 4 careful years. Asterisk, and that used to be the entire problem. Nobody wanted the one who wasn't her. Asterisk. Except, she thought, watching the orchard go soft and gray in the fading light, Darius hadn't once mentioned Rosalind. Hadn't once measured Elara against a comparison she'd carried, unspoken, into every single room she'd entered since she was 19 years old. He'd asked, on their second real conversation, what she wanted, not what Veritha's crown needed, not what her father's grief required managing, not what a dead princess would have decided in her place. It should have felt like relief. Instead it felt, disorientingly, like standing on ground she wasn't entirely sure would hold her weight. She found Darius at the wall's northern end, unexpectedly, leaning against the old stone with his arms crossed, watching the same darkening orchard she'd been watching a moment before. You walk here often, he said, not quite a question, when she reached him. Every evening, Elara said. It's quiet. Nobody comes looking for me here. I didn't mean to intrude. You're not. She surprised herself, saying it, and understood, a beat later, that she meant it. This was my sister's favorite view too once. I used to avoid it for a year after she died. Couldn't stand looking at the orchard and thinking about her instead of just looking at an orchard. Darius was quiet for a moment, giving the admission the space it needed rather than rushing to fill it with reassurance. What changed? He asked finally. I got tired of losing places, Elara said. The library, the wall, my father's study, for a while, because he couldn't look at me in there without his face doing this particular thing. She shook her head. I decided grief could have the memory. It didn't need the entire wall. That sounds like it took considerable stubbornness. It took considerable practice, Elara corrected. Stubbornness is easy. Practice is the part that actually costs you something. They stood together in comfortable, unhurried silence for a while, the orchard settling fully into dusk below them, and Elara found herself, cautiously, glancing sideways at him. Can I ask you something? She said finally. You can ask. I make no promises about answering, he said, echoing her own words from that first conversation, and something in the small, deliberate callback made her laugh, unexpected and genuine, before she'd even finished the question. Why did you actually come? She asked once she'd recovered. Not the trade meeting excuse. The real reason you stayed after. Darius considered this seriously, the same care he seemed to bring to every question she asked him. I watched you dismiss Suitor 11, he admitted. From the edge of the hall, before anyone knew I was there. You did it with this, exhausted, practiced patience like you'd rehearsed exactly how tired to sound so nobody would notice how tired you actually were underneath it. I recognized that particular performance.
He paused.
I gave a version of it myself, my first year on Fellhollow's throne. 19 years old, freshly orphaned, standing in front of a council that expected me to already know how to be a king my father spent 30 years learning to be. I got very good, very quickly, at sounding considerably more certain than I actually was. So you saw a kindred exhausted performer, Elara said, and decided to investigate. I saw someone who'd clearly been asked the wrong questions for 4 years, Darius said, and found I genuinely wanted to know the right ones. That's the whole truth of it, Elara. I don't have a more complicated answer, hiding underneath. The use of her name, plain and unadorned, without title, landed somewhere in her chest she wasn't fully prepared for. That's a considerably more honest answer than I expected, she said quietly. I'd rather be honest and disappoint you, Darius said, than say something impressive and have you eventually discover it was hollow. I've had considerable practice discovering the difference myself these past 6 years. Below them, the last of the light finally, fully gave way to full dusk, and neither of them moved to end the conversation, both apparently, cautiously, content to simply stand together at the wall a while longer. It was Petra, gathering gossip with her usual quiet efficiency from the visiting Fellhollow retinue's own servants, who first told Elara the fuller shape of Darius's own history, not because Darius had hidden anything, but because he simply hadn't yet had the occasion to lay it all out plainly, and Elara, absorbed in her own careful reassessment of him, hadn't yet thought to ask directly. His father died in a border skirmish, Petra reported, braiding Elara's hair with a particular thoroughness she brought to information she found genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. Not in battle, exactly. A scouting patrol ambushed by raiders nobody properly identified afterward. King Ashcombe was 19. No formal preparation for the crown at all, not really. His father hadn't expected to die young, so he hadn't rushed the boy's training. That sounds familiar, Elara said quietly, thinking of her own sudden, unprepared inheritance of grief 4 years earlier. There's more, Petra continued. His first year, apparently, he tried forcing through a new border treaty without properly consulting the villages it actually touched, believed, the way young rulers sometimes do, that decisive action mattered more than careful listening. nearly caused an uprising in 3 separate villages. Had to ride out personally, alone, and spend a full season simply talking to farmers and fishermen before they'd trust the crown again. He told me some of that, Alara said. Not in that much detail. The Fell Hollow servants speak of him with genuine fondness, Petra said. Not the careful, performed fondness servants use for masters they merely tolerate. The real kind. One of the grooms told me, unprompted, mind, I didn't even have to properly ask, that His Majesty still remembers every stable hand's name, asks after their families personally, and once spent an entire night helping deliver a foal because the usual hand had taken ill, and there was nobody else immediately available. Alara sat with this information for a long moment, watching her own reflection in the dressing mirror, something in her chest shifting in a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. Why are you telling me all this? She asked finally. Because I think you're falling for him, Petra said, with the blunt, unhurried honesty of someone who'd served Alara long enough to have earned the right, and I think you're too busy being careful to notice it happening. Someone ought to point it out before you talk yourself out of something genuinely good. I'm not falling for anyone, Alara said, though the protest came out considerably less firm than she'd intended. Petra said, entirely unconvinced, and said nothing further, which Alara found, irritatingly, considerably more persuasive than an actual argument would have been. She found Darius the following afternoon in the Eastern Garden, seated on a low stone bench beneath the wisteria, apparently in no particular hurry to be anywhere else, and settled beside him without quite deciding to. I heard about the border villages, she said, without preamble. Your first year. The treaty you tried to force through. Something flickered across Darius's expression, surprise, and something more guarded beneath it. My servants have been talking. Petra's very thorough, Alara said. It's one of her more useful qualities. It's not my proudest chapter, Darius admitted. I nearly cost Fell Hollow considerable stability in my eagerness to prove I could rule as decisively as my father had. I learned, that season, that decisiveness without listening is simply another word for arrogance dressed up in confidence. You wrote out yourself, Alara said. To fix it. Alone. I didn't trust anyone else to properly apologize on my behalf, Darius said. That seemed like the kind of thing a king ought to do personally, rather than delegate to an advisor who could soften the actual mistake in the retelling. Alara studied him, this careful, unhurried man who'd knelt in a crowded hall and then spent 9 days simply talking, asking, listening, never once rushing toward the outcome 11 other men had assumed was inevitable the moment they walked through the door. I think, she said slowly, testing the shape of the admission before she fully committed to it, I might understand why you came back every day better than I did a week ago. And why is that? Darius asked, something careful and hopeful in his voice. Because you're not performing certainty you don't actually have, Alara said. You're just here.
Consistently.
Without demanding I explain why that matters to me before you're willing to keep showing up. It matters to me that it matters to you, Darius said simply. That's genuinely the entire extent of my strategy, Alara. I don't have anything more calculated hiding underneath it. She found, sitting beside him beneath the slow, fragrant drift of wisteria, that she believed him completely, and that the belief itself, arriving after 4 years of careful, protective doubt, felt considerably more significant than she was fully prepared to examine just yet. King Aldrich Voss summoned Alara to his private study 2 weeks into Darius's continued, patient courtship, the first genuine, direct conversation between father and daughter Alara could remember in considerably longer than she wanted to sit down and calculate properly. She found him at his desk, exactly where he always was, surrounded by the particular controlled chaos of a man who managed grief through paperwork because paperwork, unlike grief, could always be filed and closed and set aside. The Fell Hollow King has been visiting for 2 weeks, her father said, not looking up from the documents spread before him. The council finds this development promising. The council finds most developments promising, Alara said, when they think there's a wedding attached to them. Is there a wedding attached to this one? I don't know yet, Alara said honestly. We're talking. That's all it's been so far. Her father finally looked up, and something in his expression, tired, distant, the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent 4 years grieving in a way that had cost him considerably more than his eldest daughter, made Alara's chest tighten with old, familiar, well-worn hurt. Talking, he repeated, as though the concept genuinely puzzled him. Your sister would have had this settled within a week. She always understood which conversations mattered, and which ones simply wasted time. Alara felt the comparison land exactly where it always did, a quiet, practiced wound, worn soft with repetition but no less painful for the familiarity, no less capable of stealing the breath from her chest even after 4 years of bracing for it. I'm not Rosalind, she said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she let show. I never have been. I don't think you've ever quite forgiven me for that. Her father's expression flickered, genuine surprise, or something closer to discomfort, like she'd said something aloud he'd never once expected her to say directly to his face. That's not, he started, then stopped, some old grief moving visibly, uncomfortably behind his careful composure. That's not what I meant. I don't think you meant it consciously, Alara said. I don't think that makes it less true, though. I've spent 4 years being compared to a version of myself who died alongside her, father, and I'm tired. I'm genuinely, deeply tired of trying to be someone I never was in the first place, just to earn a fraction of the attention you gave her without ever having to try. The study fell silent for a long moment, her father's hands still resting flat against the documents he'd been reviewing, his expression working through something Alara couldn't fully read, grief, certainly, but also, underneath it, something that looked, unexpectedly, like shame. I loved your sister very much, he said finally, quiet, more honest than she'd heard him in years. I think I've spent 4 years afraid that loving you the same way would mean admitting she's actually permanently gone, that the grief would become real, rather than something I could keep managing at a careful, controllable distance, filed neatly away like everything else on this desk. Alara hadn't expected that particular honesty, and it landed with considerably more weight than she'd been prepared for, sitting across the desk from him. She's gone, Alara said softly. She's been gone 4 years, father. I've had to live with that too. I lost my sister the same day you lost your daughter. I just also had to keep living in a palace where nobody seemed to notice I was still here at all. Her father was quiet for a long time after that, something old and unresolved shifting visibly behind his careful, distant composure, the particular stillness of a man confronting, for the first time in years, exactly how much his own careful management of grief had cost the daughter still standing in front of him. I don't know how to fix 4 years of that, he admitted finally. I don't know if it's fixable at all this late. I don't need it fixed all at once, Alara said. I'd just like you to actually see me occasionally, not the shadow of who I'm supposed to be instead of her. Just me, whoever that actually turns out to be. Her father nodded slowly, something in his expression considerably softer than it had been at the start of the conversation, softer than Alara could remember seeing directed at her in longer than 4 years. The Fell-Hollow King, he said, after a long moment. Does he see you? Actually see you, rather than whatever alliance the council believes you represent? Alara considered the question honestly, thinking of 2 weeks of unrehearsed library conversations, of an evening at the Eastern Wall, of a man who knelt in a crowded hall and asked what she wanted before offering anything of his own in return. I think he might, she said. I'm still finding out for certain. Then perhaps, her father said, something almost hopeful entering his tired voice, I ought to actually meet him properly myself. rather than simply reading council reports about his visits from a careful distance. It wasn't a full reconciliation. Alara understood that clearly, walking out of that study afterward, for years of careful distance didn't dissolve in the space of a single honest conversation, however overdue. But it was, she thought, considerably more than she'd expected walking in that morning, and she carried it with her, careful and cautiously warm, for the rest of the day. The trouble, when it came, arrived not from her father's counsel or from any of the previous 11 suitors nursing bruised pride, but from a small, careless comment Alara overheard entirely by accident, 3 weeks into Darius's courtship, that very nearly undid everything the previous 3 weeks had carefully, patiently built. She'd gone looking for him in the guest wing one evening, intending nothing more complicated than continuing a conversation they'd left unfinished at dinner, and had stopped short outside his open study door at the sound of his voice, mid-conversation with one of his own advisors, a sharp-featured man named Corvin who'd accompanied him from Fell Hollow. And Fell Hollow's counsel will need reassurance that Vareth's stability is genuinely secured through this match, Corvin was saying, given the succession concerns following the Crown Princess's death. It strengthens our own position considerably, having that particular alliance formally settled. I'm aware of what it strengthens, Corvin, Darius said, something tired in his voice that Alara, standing frozen just outside the door, couldn't quite interpret. I only mean, Your Majesty, that whatever genuine affection has developed, and I don't doubt it has, the political benefit remains considerable. It would be foolish to pretend otherwise when reporting back to the council. I'm not pretending anything, Darius said. I simply don't want that particular calculation to be the first thing anyone leads with, Corvin. Not to me, and certainly not anywhere near her. Alara didn't wait to hear the rest. She turned and walked back down the corridor considerably faster than she'd walked up it, old fear rising sharp and immediate in her chest, the exact fear she'd carried into every single one of the previous 11 conversations, the fear she'd let herself, cautiously, over 3 careful weeks, begin to believe might not apply this time. Considerable political benefit, Vareth's stability, the same calculations, dressed up, this time, in considerably better conversation and a genuinely charming reading habit. She avoided him for 2 full days. Told Petra, when pressed, that she had a headache, the old, convenient excuse, worn smooth from years of use, and spent most of both days in the library with the door pointedly, deliberately closed. Darius found her on the 3rd evening, at the eastern wall, exactly where she went when she needed to think without being found, except this time he'd apparently decided finding her mattered more than respecting the pattern. You've been avoiding me, he said, keeping a careful distance, not presuming to close it. I heard you, Alara said, not turning around. With Corvin, discussing how this match strengthens Fell Hollow's position with the council. Something in Darius's expression shifted, not quite guilt, but close enough to it that Alara felt the old, familiar disappointment settle heavy in her chest, confirmation of exactly the thing she'd spent 3 weeks cautiously, foolishly hoping wasn't true. That's not the whole conversation, he said carefully. It's the part that matters, Alara said. It's the part every single one of the previous 11 eventually got around to, once the pleasantries wore thin enough. Alara. He said her name the way he had that first evening at the wall, plain, unadorned, direct. I'm not going to pretend the political benefit doesn't exist. It would be a lie, and I told you 3 weeks ago I'd rather disappoint you honestly than impress you hollowly. Vareth and Fell Hollow strengthening their alliance is a genuine, real consequence of this match, whatever happens between the two of us personally. Then how is that different? Alara said, finally turning to face him, old hurt sharp in her voice, from the previous 11. From grain surpluses and sapphire mines and mothers doing the proposing. Because I didn't come here for the alliance, Darius said, something raw entering his careful composure for the first time since she'd met him. I came here because I watched you dismiss a man in a crowded hall with more dignity than most nobles manage in an entire lifetime of careful performance, and I wanted to know you. The alliance is a fact that exists alongside that, Alara, not the reason for it. I can't make the political reality disappear simply because you'd rather it didn't exist. I can only tell you, honestly, which one I actually came for. Alara stood at the wall, old fear and 3 careful weeks of cautious, growing trust warring visibly in her expression, and found she didn't have an immediate answer ready. Not the practiced, protective kind she'd have offered any of the previous 11, and not yet the fuller, more generous kind she suspected, somewhere underneath the fear, she actually wanted to offer him. I need time, she said finally.
To sit with that.
Properly, rather than simply deciding in the moment because you're standing here saying the right words. Take it, Darius said immediately without argument. However long you need. I'm not going anywhere, Alara. Not because of the alliance. Because I meant what I said 3 weeks ago, and I intend to keep meaning it whether you decide, eventually, to believe me or not. He left her alone at the wall, and Alara stood there a long while after he'd gone, watching the orchard settle into dusk below her, turning the entire conversation over and over, searching, carefully, thoroughly, the way she searched everything, for the crack that would confirm her old, well-practiced fear. She didn't find one. That, more than anything else, was what finally, slowly began to change her mind. It took her 4 more days to seek him out again. 4 days of careful thought, of long walks along the wall, of one more honest conversation with Petra that ended with her maid saying, gently but firmly, "You can be careful forever, Alara, or you can be brave once. I don't think you get both." She found him in the library, on the 5th morning, in the chair he'd made his own over 3 careful weeks, reading something he set aside the moment he saw her in the doorway. "I've thought about it," Alara said, before either of them could say anything else. "The conversation you had with Corvin, the alliance, all of it." And, Darius asked, careful, giving her the space to finish. "And I don't think you're lying," Alara said. "I think the alliance is real, exactly like you said. I think it's also true that you didn't come here for it, and I think," she paused, gathering the rest of the thought carefully, "I think I've spent 4 years so afraid of being wanted for the wrong reasons that I nearly talked myself out of being wanted for the right ones too, because they arrived standing next to something political rather than entirely, purely separate from it." Darius said nothing, letting her finish. "Nothing in my life has ever been entirely separate from politics," Alara continued. "Not since I was 19. I think I finally understand that expecting it to be, from you, was an unfair standard I never once applied to anyone else in this palace. Not even myself. That's considerable grace," Darius said quietly, "to extend someone who frightened you badly enough to avoid him for 2 days. I'm not finished being frightened," Alara admitted. "I don't think I will be, entirely, for a while yet. But I'd rather be frightened and honest about it than careful and alone. I've had 4 years of careful and alone. I'm considerably more tired of that than I am of being frightened." Darius rose from his chair, crossing the small distance between them, stopping close enough for conversation but careful, still, about closing it entirely without her invitation. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, without preamble, without the build-up she might have expected. "Not today, necessarily. I don't want you to feel rushed after everything we just discussed. But soon. And I want to tell you, plainly, exactly why, so there's no ambiguity left for either of us to trip over." "Go on," Alara said, her heart considerably louder in her own ears than she wanted to admit. "I want to marry you because I've spent 3 weeks talking to you about history and grief, and the particular loneliness of being overlooked by people who ought to have paid closer attention," Darius said. "Because I've watched you slowly, cautiously let your guard down, Not for the kneeling, not for anything I performed, but because I kept showing up honestly, week after week, without demanding anything in return except your honest company. Because Fellhollow's alliance with Vareth is a genuine, welcome benefit, and also entirely beside the point of what I actually want, which is considerably simpler and considerably more selfish than any treaty. He paused. I want to marry you because I think I've fallen in love with exactly who you are, Alara, the quiet one, the one who prefers books to receptions, the one who's spent 4 years being told she's a lesser version of someone she never actually was. I don't want the version of you the court expects. I want this one, the real one, standing in front of me right now, frightened and honest about it. Alara felt something in her chest crack fully open. 3 weeks of careful hope and 4 days of careful doubt, finally, completely allowed to surface all at once. That's a considerably better proposal than the 11 that came before it, she said, her voice not quite steady. I should hope so, Darius said, something warm entering his voice despite the careful gravity of the moment. Though I confess I still don't actually know if it worked. You haven't answered. Alara considered him, this man who'd knelt before he'd asked anything, who'd spent 3 weeks simply talking rather than performing, who'd let her walk away for 4 full days without once pursuing her before she was ready, who stood now, close and steady and entirely unhurried, waiting for whatever answer she actually meant to give. I have one condition, she said finally. Name it. I don't want to become Fellhollow's queen and simply disappear into that role the way I disappeared into being Varetha's forgotten princess, Alara said. I want to matter there too. Not as an ornament attached to your alliance. As someone with genuine purpose, whatever that eventually turns out to look like. I would want nothing less, Darius said immediately, without hesitation. I think, honestly, Fellhollow could use exactly the kind of careful, thoughtful mind you've demonstrated these past 3 weeks. I'm not looking for a decorative queen, Alara. I never was. I'm looking for a partner. Alara studied him a final, considering moment, 3 weeks of hope and 4 days of doubt finally, fully settling into something considerably more certain than either. Then yes, she said. I'll marry you. Not because you're the 12th suitor who finally wore me down. Because you're the first one who actually asked what I wanted and meant it enough to keep asking and to keep waiting without ever once making me feel like a transaction, even when the transaction was sitting right there in the room with us the whole time. Darius's careful composure broke into something genuinely, unguardedly happy, not triumphant, not performed, just relieved and glad in a way that matched, precisely, everything Alara had spent 3 difficult weeks cautiously hoping might actually turn out to be real. The wedding took place in early autumn, in Varetha's Grand Cathedral, though Alara had insisted on keeping the ceremony considerably smaller and quieter than court traditions typically demanded, a decision that met, surprisingly, with her father's genuine support rather than the careful political calculation she'd half expected from him. Your sister would have wanted the full ceremony, he told her, the morning of the wedding, both of them standing together in a quiet antechamber while the cathedral filled beyond the closed doors. The grand procession, every noble family in the Northern Territories in attendance. I'm not my sister, Alara said, not unkindly, simply stating a fact they'd both grown considerably more comfortable acknowledging over the past several months. No, her father agreed, something gentler in his voice than Alara remembered from most of her childhood, let alone the 4 grieving years since. You're not. I've been learning these past months to actually see the difference properly. I think I owe you an apology for how long that took me. You've been trying, Alara said. That matters, even if it took longer than either of us would have liked it to. Her father studied her for a long moment, something openly emotional moving behind his careful composure, considerably more visible than she was used to seeing from him, even after months of slow, deliberate rebuilding. I am proud of you, he said, quiet, direct in a way he rarely managed even now. Not because you're marrying a good king, though you are. Because you refused 11 men who wanted your title rather than you, and you waited, patiently, stubbornly, for someone who actually understood the difference. That took considerable courage, Alara. More than I think I properly appreciated, watching from the sidelines these past 4 years, while I managed my own grief instead of noticing yours. Alara felt tears threaten, unexpected and genuine, at words she'd waited considerably longer than 4 years to hear spoken plainly. "Thank you," she managed, "for finally saying that." "I should have said it years ago," her father admitted. "I can't undo that. But I intend to keep saying it, going forward, for however many years we have left to make up the difference." He walked her down the aisle himself, an hour later, past a cathedral considerably fuller than Alara had originally wanted. Word had spread, apparently, and half the court had found reasons to attend regardless of the intimate guest list she'd requested. But watching her father's genuinely proud expression beside her, she found it felt exactly right regardless of the crowd. Darius waited at the altar, dressed simply, watching her approach with an expression that held nothing of the careful political performance she'd grown accustomed to expecting from every suitor before him. Just open, genuine warmth, considerably more valuable than any of the 11 proposals that had come before his. "You look terrified," she murmured, once she'd reached him, her father stepping back to join the assembled crowd. "I am, slightly," Darius admitted, quiet enough for only her to hear. "I've spent 3 weeks and considerable 4 days of doubt earning the right to stand here. I'd rather not waste it now by saying something as unfortunate as comparing your eyes to a sapphire mine." Alara laughed, genuine and unguarded, right there at the altar, and felt the last of her old, careful caution finally, completely settle into something that felt, for the first time in 4 long years, entirely and uncomplicatedly like belonging somewhere. Fell hollow, when Alara finally saw it properly for the first time as its queen rather than a visiting curiosity, looked exactly the way Petra's servant gossip had described it, smaller than Verith, considerably less grand, its castle built from warm gray stone rather than Verith's pale, ceremonial marble, everything about it suggesting a kingdom built for genuine use rather than careful display. She learned it slowly, the way she'd learned Darius, not through grand tours and formal presentations, though there were some of those, but through the accumulation of small, ordinary moments that mattered considerably more than she'd initially expected them to. She learned the names of the stable hands, the way Darius apparently always had. She learned that the council here argued considerably more openly than Veritha's ever had, and that Darius genuinely welcomed the disagreement rather than merely tolerating it, understanding, from 6 years of hard-won experience, that a council too frightened to argue with its king was a council that would eventually let him walk directly into another disaster, like the one his own careless first year had nearly caused. She began attending those council sessions herself, within her first month, quiet at first, listening considerably more than speaking, and then, gradually, asking careful questions nobody else had thought to raise, about the border village's grain reserves, about a fishing dispute simmering in the Northern Territories, about whether Fellhollow's Healers Guild had sufficient funding to properly train the apprentices it kept turning away for lack of resources. "You've been busy," Darius observed one evening, finding her in Fellhollow's own smaller, considerably less grand library, a stack of council reports open across her lap alongside whatever novel she'd been attempting to read between them. "I told you I didn't want to disappear into decoration," Alara said, not looking up. "I meant it. I remember," Darius said, settling into the chair across from her, his habit now, wherever she happened to be reading, the same easy, unhurried presence he'd brought to Veritha's library months earlier. "The Healers Guild funding. I saw your notes in Chancellor Reyes's latest report." He seemed considerably impressed, for a man who doesn't impress easily. "Ask good questions," Alara said. "That's all it took." Nobody had bothered asking them properly before, apparently, too busy assuming the guild's needs would simply sort themselves out eventually. That sounds familiar, Darius said, something warm and genuinely admiring in his voice. Rather like a princess who spent 4 years being asked the wrong questions herself before someone finally thought to ask the right one. Alara looked up at that, something soft settling behind her expression. You're going to keep bringing that up, aren't you? For the rest of our lives. Probably, Darius admitted, entirely unrepentant. It's a genuinely good story. I don't see why I should stop telling it just because we're both thoroughly tired of hearing it by now. She threw a small cushion at him, which he caught without much effort, laughing, and the library, smaller, quieter, considerably less grand than Veritha's, settled around them into exactly the kind of warm, ordinary contentment Alara had spent 4 careful years believing she'd never actually get to have. Her father visited Fell Hollow for the first time the following spring. Awkward, at the start, in the particular way of 2 people rebuilding a relationship considerably later than either of them wished they'd started, and steadily, genuinely warmer over the course of the week he stayed, as 4 years of careful distance slowly, patiently continued closing. He found Alara, on his final morning, in Fell Hollow's small library, curled into a window seat with a book she wasn't entirely reading, watching the northern light do something soft and forgiving across the room the way Veritha's eastern light once had. You look happy, he said, settling into the chair across from her. The same chair Darius always chose, Alara noticed, with a small private smile she didn't bother explaining. I am, she said simply. Considerably more than I expected to be, if I'm honest. Her father was quiet a moment, watching her with an expression that held, finally, none of the old careful distance, none of the grief he'd once managed by simply not looking too closely. Rosalind would have liked him, he said, unexpectedly. I think. She always did prefer people who said what they actually meant. Alara felt the mention of her sister land differently than it once would have, not as a comparison, not as a wound worn soft with repetition, but simply as a memory, offered freely, the way a father might once have offered it to a daughter he'd never stopped seeing clearly. I think she would have too, Alara said, and found, saying it, that the grief and the gladness could sit together in the same sentence without either one needing to cancel the other out. Her father left the following day, promising to return before winter, and Alara watched his carriage disappear down the long northern road with a feeling she hadn't fully had access to in 4 years. Not quite peace, exactly, but something steady enough to build peace out of, given time. She found Darius later that same evening in the small garden behind the castle, where he'd taken to spending the last hour before dinner most days, and settled beside him on the low stone bench without needing to explain why. Good visit, he asked. Good visit, Alara confirmed. He said Rosalind would have liked you. High praise, from what I understand of her, Darius said. I confess I never expected to be measured against a woman I never had the chance to meet. You held up well, Alara said. Considerably better than 11 other men who never got the chance to be measured against anyone at all, because I never let them close enough to try. Darius reached for her hand, unhurried, the way he did most things, and Alara let him take it, watching the evening settle gold and quiet over Fell Hollow's modest, sturdy walls. She thought, sometimes still, about the girl who'd sat in Veritha's receiving hall refusing suitor after suitor with tired, practiced patience, certain she'd simply grown too difficult, too proud, too forgotten to ever properly be chosen for the right reasons. She didn't think that girl had been wrong to wait. She thought, watching the last of the light fade over a garden that had, somehow, over the course of a single year, become genuinely hers, that the waiting had simply been the necessary shape of getting here, to this bench, this hand in hers, this quiet, ordinary evening that asked nothing of her except to sit in it, fully seen, exactly as she was.
The end.